There are moments when life begins to sound like an echo. The laughter that once colored your mornings fades into a low hum you can barely hear. You walk the same streets, meet the same faces, yet everything feels slightly out of tune, like the world is continuing its song, but you've forgotten the melody. It is here, in this uneasy silence, that the soul starts whispering, "You are no longer who you were, and not yet who you are becoming." Carl Jung called this the threshold of individuation, the subtle beginning of the inner journey. It rarely starts with triumph. It begins with confusion. The mountain you must climb rises not before your eyes, but inside your chest. Its fog is woven from uncertainty, fear, and a strange longing to shed the skin of your old self. You keep moving, though the path is invisible, no one applauds, no one even notices, and still you walk. At first, loneliness feels like exile. You think you've been abandoned by the world, but soon something shifts. The silence stops feeling hostile. The air grows thick with meaning. Beneath the loneliness, you start to sense presence, a deeper current, like the sea below a frozen surface. Jung would have said this is the self calling you home, pulling you inward where all true transformation begins. The descent into solitude. In our culture, we're taught to fear solitude. We equate being alone with failure, emptiness, or rejection. But Jung saw solitude as the laboratory of the soul, the place where the fragments of the psyche begin to realign. When you are finally stripped of the noise of admiration and the comfort of belonging, you meet the one companion who has waited your entire life to be seen yourself. It is not a pleasant meeting at first. The mind rebels. Old patterns scream for distraction. You'll find yourself reaching for your phone, for conversation, for any proof that you still exist in the eyes of others. Yet, the longer you resist the pull outward, the more the inner voice insists. It asks questions that sting. What are you hiding from? Whose approval built your identity? Why does silence scare you? The first stage of the Jungian path, the stage of loneliness as the silent teacher, is where the mask begins to crack. Jung called this mask the persona, the social identity you craft to survive among others. You smile when you want to cry, agree when you want to scream, perform when you want to rest. But solitude exposes the gaps between your mask and your truth. Every false layer begins to peel away. It's no wonder most people never complete this stage. The quiet can feel unbearable. You start to miss even the noise that once exhausted you. Yet as you sit with it long enough, you notice something miraculous. Beneath the ache, there is peace. Beneath the fear, there is freedom. You start to realize that loneliness isn't a void, it's a mirror. It reflects what you've ignored in yourself. One evening, as dusk melts into night, you might feel a small spark, an unfamiliar tenderness toward your own pain. It's the first flicker of self-companionship, the birth of inner maturity. The fog hasn't lifted yet, but you are no longer terrified of it. You're learning to breathe inside it. When the world stops applauding. In the outer world, growth looks glamorous, success, progress, milestones. But the inner world has its own language, quiet, invisible, often misunderstood. People may not recognize the battles you're fighting. They won't see the nights you spent wrestling with yourself. They might even mistake your retreat for laziness, your silence for weakness. But you feel the tectonic shift within the deep rearrangement of everything you believed about who you are. This is why Jung said that rebirth always begins with dissolution. Something has to die. The need to be seen, the compulsion to be liked, the illusion of control. The ego will protest, of course. It will say, Without admiration, you'll disappear. But the soul knows that disappearing from the wrong gaze is the first step to being truly seen. There's an image Jung loved, the night sea journey, borrowed from ancient myth. The hero sails across dark, unknowable waters toward an unseen shore. There is no map, no lighthouse, only intuition and endurance. You are that traveler now. Every time you choose silence over validation, introspection over distraction, you steer your vessel through those black waves, learning to soothe yourself. After solitude comes confrontation, the meeting with your own emotional turbulence. Without external validation to stabilize you, every wound resurfaces. Fear of abandonment, memories of rejection, the child who was never heard, all rise from the deep. Jung saw this as the emergence of the shadow, the repressed part of the psyche that contains not only your darkness but also your vitality. Most people mistake this stage for regression. They say, I was healing and now I feel worse. But the psyche works like the body. It brings the poison to the surface before it can be cleansed. You are not falling apart. You are detoxing from dependency. Self-soothing becomes your medicine. It's not about denying pain, but learning to hold it with awareness. When sadness visits, you sit beside it. When anxiety grips you, you breathe through it. You speak to yourself not as a critic, but as a caretaker. I am here, you whisper, and I'm not leaving. That simple act rewires the nervous system. It teaches the inner child that safety can exist inside you. You begin to notice patterns. You used to look for rescuers, friends, lovers, mentors to fix your emotions. Now you understand that asking others to regulate your peace is like handing them the strings to your heart. Jung would call this projection the unconscious transfer of responsibility onto others. When you withdraw those projections, you reclaim power. A woman once told me, I realized I didn't miss him. I missed the version of myself that felt safe when he was around. That realization freed her. She stopped trying to fill the emptiness with someone else's presence and started filling it with her own. This is what Jung called integration. The scattered parts of the self, child, adult, dreamer, protector start learning to coexist. You are no longer chasing wholeness outside yourself. You're cultivating it within, the mirror of emotion. At this stage, your emotional landscape changes. Instead of running from discomfort, you observe it. You see anger not as a flaw, but as a messenger of unmet needs. You recognize jealousy as an invitation to honor your desires. You treat every emotion as sacred communication from the unconscious. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. By learning to sit with your feelings, you begin to reclaim authorship of your story. You stop waiting for others to grant you permission to feel. You stop labeling your emotions as good or bad. You realize they are simply energy in motion, the psyche's language of transformation. There's a beauty in this self-soothing phase that outsiders rarely see. To them, you appear withdrawn. But within, something luminous is forming, a quiet trust in your own resilience. You are learning to mother yourself, to father yourself, to be the guardian your younger self never had. This is not selfishness. It's psychological adulthood. The temptation to complain. Once you start healing, a new trap appears more subtle than dependency, more seductive than pain. It's the habit of complaining. The ego loves complaint because it disguises itself as honesty. You think you're just describing reality, but in truth you're reinforcing helplessness. Every sentence that begins with, no one understands me, or life is unfair, anchors you to victimhood. Jung called this the negative inflation of the ego, where the self-pitying voice becomes a tyrant that feeds on your energy. To escape it, you must change your internal question. Instead of why is this happening to me, ask what is this asking of me? That single shift moves you from paralysis to purpose. It's not about silencing emotion, it's about transforming it. When you feel the urge to complain, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, what action can I take, however small, to honor my pain without worshipping it? Each small act, writing, walking, creating, releases energy trapped in resentment. A friend once told me she spent 6 months telling everyone how cruelly her colleagues had treated her. One night she wrote in her journal, "If no one could hear my complaint, would I still repeat it?" The answer was no. That night marked her liberation. She stopped narrating her suffering and began narrating her healing. Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Each time you replace a complaint with a choice, you enact that truth. You stop being the victim of your narrative and become its author, choosing responsibility over reaction. Responsibility is not blame, it's the ability to respond. The moment you accept that your reaction is within your control, the world changes color. External chaos loses its power because your inner anchor holds steady. When storms hit, you remember the oak in winter. Every gust strengthens its roots. Likewise, every challenge deepens your awareness. Life's friction doesn't exist to punish, it exists to polish. The soul, like a river stone, becomes smooth through continuous impact. This realization doesn't make you immune to pain, it makes you immune to despair. You can still cry, grieve, or feel lost, but you no longer drown. You float on the current, trusting its direction even when you can't see the shore. Jung believed that consciousness expands through confrontation with difficulty. He compared it to alchemy, the ancient art of turning base metals into gold. In alchemical language, complaint is lead, responsibility is fire, transformation is gold. Each time you resist the urge to complain, you place the lead of your suffering into the furnace of awareness, and something radiant begins to form. The quiet strength emerging. By now, the loneliness that once haunted you begins to shift texture. It no longer feels like absence, but presence, dense, sacred, almost holy. You start to enjoy your own company. You catch yourself smiling during simple moments. The sound of rain, the smell of coffee, the warmth of sunlight on your hands. These moments are not grand, yet they feel complete. They are glimpses of what Jung called self-realization, the harmony between the conscious ego and the deeper self. The world still doesn't applaud. Few notice the invisible battles you've won, but you no longer need them to. You understand that validation from others is like perfume, pleasant but fleeting. Validation from within is oxygen, it keeps you alive. When you look back, you see how far you've come. The fog hasn't vanished, but you've learned to navigate it with grace. You realize that the purpose of solitude wasn't to isolate you from others, but to unite you with yourself. In the language of myth, this is the midpoint of the hero's journey, the moment when the hero descends into the underworld, faces their shadow, and begins to rise with new eyes. You are that hero, though no one may ever write your story. The transformation is invisible, but its effects will ripple through every part of your life, your relationships, your work, your presence. You've begun to embody what Jung called the individuated self, someone who no longer lives according to external expectations, but according to inner truth. There comes a moment in every seeker's journey when the silence grows heavy again, not the suffocating silence of the first descent, but a different one, finer, subtler. You have already learned to walk alone, to soothe your own storms, to speak gently to the child within. Yet when you look around, something still feels missing. You are working, creating, healing. Still, the world remains indifferent. You send your light into the world and hear nothing echo back. No one claps. No one says, I see you. And it is here that the soul faces one of its most invisible tests, the silence of being unseen, the silence of the unseen. To the ego, recognition is oxygen. It feeds on reflection, the approving glance, the congratulatory word, the comforting assurance that our efforts matter. But as Jung warned, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because once you accept yourself fully, external approval loses its spell, and with that loss comes vertigo. You begin to ask, if no one notices my goodness, my effort, my devotion, does it still have meaning? The answer, whispered by the self, is always yes. Self-validation is the bridge between spiritual adolescence and psychological maturity. It's the moment you become your own witness, the observer who sees without judgment, the inner friend who nods and says, I know how much this cost you. When no one else applauds, you learn to bow to yourself. The art of self-recognition. Imagine a candle burning in an empty cathedral. There is no audience, no congregation, no priest, only the slow breathing of light against stone. The candle does not flicker for approval. It burns because that is its nature. So too with you. When you work late into the night, when you choose integrity over comfort, when you remain kind, though no one returns it, that is your cathedral. No eyes need witness it. The act itself is sacred. Jung described this state as the union of the ego with the self, a merging where your actions no longer seek external reward but express inner alignment. You stop doing good to be seen as good. You do it because goodness has become your instinct. One woman told me she used to spend hours perfecting reports at work, desperate for praise. When promotions passed her by, she spiraled into resentment. Then one night she realized, my worth cannot hang on someone else's blindness. From that day she began to write her own acknowledgements. After every project she'd pour herself tea, open her notebook, and list what she had done well. I stopped working for applause, she said. I started working to respect myself. It sounds small, but that single shift rewires an entire psyche. The nervous system relaxes. The heart no longer races after validation. The body begins to feel safe in its own company. Self-validation isn't arrogance, it's emotional sovereignty. The invisible reward. Society celebrates visible success, trophies, likes, recognition. But the psyche measures achievement differently. For Jung, the true sign of development is inner stability, the ability to remain whole regardless of outer circumstances. When you cease to depend on praise, your energy stops leaking outward. You redirect it inward, toward creation, reflection, and depth. That reclaimed energy becomes intuition. You start to sense what truly matters. And in that stability, something quiet happens. The world begins to mirror your calm. Without asking, you inspire. Without shouting, you influence. Not because you perform, but because authenticity carries its own frequency. The paradox is timeless. Only when you stop seeking recognition do you become radiant. The descent into failure, but the path of awakening does not rise endlessly upward. Once self-validation strengthens the heart, life introduces a new teacher, failure. Failure is the holy fire of individuation. It arrives precisely when you think you've understood strength. It tears down what pride built, exposing where humility must take root. To the ego, failure feels like death. It whispers, "You've lost everything, you are nothing." But Jung saw failure differently. "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," he wrote. "The collapse of one identity is always the birth of another." When you stumble after great effort, you're not being punished, you're being refined. Falling into the fire, consider the blacksmith's forge. The metal must be heated until it glows, pounded until its impurities rise to the surface. Each strike seems destructive, but without those blows, the sword remains brittle. So too with the soul. The heat of failure softens the rigid ego. The blows of disappointment shape resilience. Jung compared this process to alchemy. The base metal your untested self must endure, nigredo, the dark stage of decomposition, before transmutation can occur. It is messy, humiliating, raw. You question your purpose. You doubt your progress. Yet beneath that despair, chemical magic unfolds. The separation of gold from dross, essence from illusion. Many stop here, mistaking purification for punishment. They retreat into complaint or shame, returning to old comfort zones. But those who stay, who keep breathing through the heat, emerge transformed. The lesson hidden in every form. I once met a man who built a company from nothing. For years he lived in adrenaline deals, flights, meetings. Then a financial crisis wiped it all out. "It felt like the universe ripped my identity from me," he said. For months he couldn't get out of bed. But eventually, silence pressed him into reflection. He asked himself, if success defined me, who was I before I succeeded? That question became his turning point. He began volunteering, meditating, reading Jung. "Failure gave me back my soul," he told me. "I had been rich in money but poor in meaning. Now I'm rich in peace." This is the paradox of failure. It breaks your illusions but restores your essence, from collapse to clarity. When failure strikes, you encounter your shadow arrogance, the secret belief that success proves worthiness. Its collapse reveals the truth. Worth was never in outcome, but in being. From a neurological view, failure activates the brain's error monitoring system, the anterior cingulate cortex. It lights up like a red flare saying, "A just course." But emotional self-talk determines whether that signal becomes paralysis or progress. Self-criticism floods the body with cortisol, freezing you. Self-compassion releases dopamine, reigniting movement. In Jungian terms, that moment of self-forgiveness is the alchemical marriage, the union of opposites, the striving ego and the accepting soul. You stop judging yourself for falling and start learning how to rise consciously. The Phoenix Principle. Ancient myths understood what psychology later confirmed. Transformation demands burning. The phoenix does not fear its pyre. It knows the flames reveal its next form. When you embrace failure as initiation, the ashes no longer represent loss. They become soil, seeds germinate there. Humility, patience, perspective. You begin to see that what died was not you, only the version of you that could not continue. Jung wrote to a colleague, "Mistakes are, after all, the foundations of truth. Every failure becomes a teacher, every collapse a curriculum in authenticity." The self, like a wise mentor, orchestrates these trials to remind the ego of its limits and the soul of its vastness. Integrating the shadow of defeat. Most people either deny failure or drown in it. Integration means neither. It means looking directly at what happened and saying, "Yes, this too is me." The shadow of defeat holds valuable gold. Realism, humility, compassion for others' struggles. When you own your failure, You stop projecting it. You no longer envy others' victories because you understand the cost behind them. You relate to humanity, not from superiority, but solidarity. That humility opens a deeper channel of creativity. The artist who once painted for fame now paints from truth. The teacher who once spoke for applause now speaks for clarity. The parent who once sought perfection now offers presence. Failure strips the performance from life and returns you to essence. Action as antidote. There is one more secret in the alchemy of failure. Movement heals faster than rumination. After the fall, the temptation to freeze is strong. The ego wants to hide until it can rise perfect again. But perfection is paralysis in disguise. The cure is simple, though not easy. Act. Take one step, however small. Write one line, clean one corner, speak one truth. Every act signals to the unconscious we are still alive. In Jungian therapy, this is called active imagination, bridging inner image and outer deed. When you act, you turn psychological insight into lived experience. You pull energy out of the mind and ground it in the body. That movement reawakens the self-confidence in you. The fire becomes light. Slowly, as weeks turn to months, the sting of failure softens. Gratitude sneaks in. You start to thank the very events that broke you because they delivered honesty. You realize you can survive endings. That realization changes everything. You no longer chase success out of fear. You pursue meaning out of joy. You no longer strive to prove. You strive to express. Work becomes offering, not obligation. Love becomes choice, not dependency. That is the true gold of alchemy. The emergence of the inner light that does not flicker with circumstance. The mirror of will. When failure transforms into wisdom, a new kind of power awakens. Will. Not the frantic will of control, but the steady flame of purpose. It is will that carries you forward when inspiration vanishes, when applause is absent, when the path is invisible again. Jung said that will is the organizing principle of consciousness. It aligns your fragmented parts toward a single aim, authenticity. The ego says, I act when I feel ready. The self replies, act, and readiness will follow. This is the threshold of mastery, the sixth stage of becoming, where discipline replaces mood and constancy replaces emotion. But that lesson awaits in the next part of the journey. There comes a time when even clarity feels heavy. You have risen from failure, dusted the ashes, and taken your first steps again. Yet the path ahead looks endless, and the wind no longer carries the thrill of discovery. You do not feel inspired, you feel tired. The world is quiet, your progress invisible. And here the soul faces another sacred trial, the test of will, beyond emotion. Modern culture worships feeling. It tells you to wait for motivation, to chase passion, to do only what excites you. But passion is a firework, bright, loud, and short-lived. Jung understood something quieter and truer. The psyche matures when action ceases to depend on mood. He wrote that will is the energy that reorganizes the entire personality. When you act from will, you no longer chase the storm of inspiration. You become the river that keeps moving even when the sky is still. This stage begins when you realize that emotion is weather and will is climate. Emotion changes by the hour, but will endures through seasons. On days when the heart feels empty, will is the pulse that says, continue anyway. Each act performed without enthusiasm becomes a brick in the cathedral of integrity. To the ego, such constancy seems dull. It craves intensity, the adrenaline of beginnings, the applause of endings. But will teaches you to find holiness in repetition, in showing up for life the way the sun shows up for dawn, without fanfare, without excuse. The discipline of the soul. Discipline is often mistaken for rigidity, but in Jungian language it is devotion, the ego's surrender to the organizing rhythm of the self. You wake before dawn not to prove strength, but to honor a promise to your own becoming. You sit to write, paint, study, pray, not because you feel like it, but because the act itself shapes the vessel through which the soul will later pour light. Think of monks ringing the same bell every morning for decades. The sound does not grow less sacred through repetition. It becomes the heartbeat of the monastery. In the same way, your daily efforts, exercise, study, reflection become rituals through which chaos is tamed and meaning condensed. Each routine is a small circle drawn around the ego to remind it who leads. When you act despite inertia, you begin to feel a strange joy that has nothing to do with excitement. It is quieter, like the warmth of steady coals after the flame. You start trusting yourself. You realize that you do not need to feel capable to be capable. Will as inner authority. Jung believed the greatest freedom is to do gladly that which one must do. At first glance, this seems paradoxical. How can obligation be gladness? But the moment you align duty with destiny, necessity becomes sacred. You stop fighting what life asks of you and start performing it as an offering. This alignment births inner authority. The external world loses power to dictate your rhythm because the command now comes from within. You no longer need the push of deadlines or the pull of praise. You act because action is alignment, because movement keeps the channels between conscious and unconscious clear. A musician once told me, the hardest part isn't playing concerts, it's practicing alone when no one listens. I asked what keeps him going. He said, discipline is how I pray. The repetition opens a doorway where inspiration sometimes enters. That is the essence of will, persistence as prayer, effort as invitation. When you master that, you stop chasing miracles. They begin visiting you unannounced. The still point, after months or years of such steady living, something unexpected happens. You stop seeking intensity altogether. The peaks and valleys that once defined you level into a calm horizon. Friends might say you've become reserved. In truth, you've become centered. Jung wrote that the self is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. When will anchors you, you start sensing that center, a still point inside that watches without judgment, moves without hurry. The storms still come, but they no longer uproot you. Emotion becomes weather passing over an unmoving sky. This stillness can feel unfamiliar. Many mistake it for emptiness because drama has been their measure of aliveness. But the absence of turmoil is not numbness. It is equilibrium. What you are feeling is peace. A peace so profound the ego interprets it as boredom. Do not run from it. Let the quiet rewire your nervous system. Let the silence teach your body that safety no longer depends on chaos. When inspiration returns, ironically, once you no longer need inspiration, it returns but now as grace, not addiction. Ideas flow not from desperation but from overflow. The artist paints without anxiety about reception. The writer writes not to be read but because the words want to exist. The entrepreneur builds not to prove but to serve. Work becomes play again because it's rooted in purpose, not ego. You discover a rhythm between effort and ease, doing and being, masculine will and feminine receptivity. Jung described this integration as the conjunctio, the sacred marriage within the joining of opposites that creates wholeness. Discipline without grace becomes tyranny. Grace without discipline dissolves into chaos. But together they birth creativity that sustains itself. The will that serves life. The highest form of will is not domination but cooperation with the unconscious. Jung said that the goal of individuation is not to control the psyche but to live in dialogue with it. When your conscious will aligns with the deeper rhythms of the self, coincidence begins to dance around you, what Jung called synchronicity. Events unfold with uncanny precision. Doors open where effort once failed. The universe seems to meet you halfway because you are finally rowing with its current, not against it. But this harmony demands humility. The will must remain flexible, like a reed that bends with the wind. The moment you try to force destiny, stagnation returns. True will moves with awareness, not stubbornness. It listens inwardly before acting outwardly. To cultivate this, Jung advised paying attention to dreams, to slips of the tongue, to bodily sensations. These are the whispers of the unconscious guiding the will. Each morning, ask not only, what do I want, but what is life asking of me today? The first is ego's question. The second is the self's. The return of solitude. Once will and self begin to harmonize, you circle back to the silence from which you started, but this time it feels different. Earlier solitude was exile. Now it is sanctuary. You no longer fear being alone because you are accompanied by purpose. Loneliness transforms into solitude, the sacred space where creativity refuels. You might spend long hours in stillness, not because you're lost, but because you're listening. Ideas descend like gentle rain. Patterns once invisible reveal themselves. You begin to understand what mystics meant by the inner voice. The world may still appear unchanged, same job, same streets, same obligations, yet internally everything glows with quiet order. You carry equilibrium into noise, light into shadow. The ego still whispers, the world still tests, but your center holds. When the will meets love, the next revelation emerges subtly. Will alone is not enough. The soul longs not only to act, but to love. And love here is not romance, it's the willingness to include, to embrace the shadow you once resisted. Jung taught that true individuation integrates both light and darkness. As your discipline strengthens, compassion must widen, or your will hardens into pride. So the self sends reminders, difficult people, unforeseen obstacles to soften your strength into tenderness. You begin to see that everyone is fighting the same invisible battles. Self-doubt, fear, longing for meaning. Judgment gives way to empathy. You act firmly but kindly, clearly but gently. You discover that the mature soul is neither rigid nor weak. It is flexible, aware, forgiving. Love becomes the invisible current beneath will. The reason discipline doesn't decay into bitterness. Without love, endurance becomes punishment. With love, endurance becomes art. The final test, the need to be understood. After will and love begin their dance, the last human hunger remains the desire to be understood. You have grown, endured, served, and still the world may not see you. This is the seventh and final threshold. Understanding, like validation, belongs to the realm of others. But individuation requires stepping beyond even this. For no one, not partner, not parent, nor teacher can fully comprehend the totality that is you. Only the self can. The final liberation is realizing that you don't need translation to be real. When you stop seeking to be understood, you enter pure being. Your energy no longer leaks through explanation. You live transparently, even if no one reads the script. The light within becomes self-luminous. The awakening. There comes a morning quiet, unremarkable, when you wake and notice a calm you cannot explain. You make coffee, look out the window, and realize you no longer crave the noise that once defined you. The mountain you have been climbing is behind you, yet somehow also within you. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." You have looked inward long enough that your dreams now move through daylight. The unconscious no longer hides, it partners. You find beauty in ordinary things, a child's laughter, the pattern of light on the wall, the rhythm of your own breath. Life hasn't changed, perception has. The fog of the old self has burned away. What remains is presence. You begin to see through eyes that do not judge but witness, ears that do not crave but listen, a heart that does not grasp but radiates. You are not performing peace, you have become it. Living the integration. Integration does not mean perfection, it means wholeness. You still feel fear, sadness, anger, but they move through you like weather through open sky. You no longer identify with them. The shadow is no longer enemy but ally. Failure no longer threat but feedback. Loneliness no longer absence but teacher. You operate from what Jung called the center of gravity in the self. Decisions feel less like choices and more like recognition, each one already aligned with a deeper truth you can finally hear. You begin to trust the invisible hand guiding you, not as superstition but as participation in the unfolding order of life. At this stage, people may ask, what changed? You might smile and say, nothing and everything. Because there are no fireworks, only stillness, no dramatic rebirth, only quiet clarity. Yet from that clarity flows a power no chaos can shake, the light that needs no witness. The mature soul does not announce itself. It simply is like a lighthouse. It shines not to be admired but to guide. The beam rotates through fog and storm, indifferent to whether ships thank it. Its existence is its message. You are that lighthouse now. The light that once sought recognition now exists for service. Every act, word, and silence becomes part of its beam. You no longer need to be understood. You become understanding itself. When you walk into a room, others feel calmer without knowing why. When you speak, your words carry weight because they come from integration, not performance. You lead without trying, teach without preaching, heal without fixing. Presence itself becomes medicine. The circle closes. Look back for a moment. The path that began in loneliness ends in luminous solitude. The self that once begged to be seen now sees. The mountain you climbed was your own interior landscape. The fog you feared was simply unconsciousness evaporating. You have learned that life's greatest transformations happen quietly without witnesses, applause, or certainty. They happen when no one is watching and you choose again and again not to abandon yourself. The circle closes where it began in silence, but this time the silence sings. The fog has lifted. The mountain stands clear in the morning light. You have walked its paths through loneliness, discipline, fire, and awakening. You have met the child within, the shadow that hid in corners, the unbroken thread of will that kept you moving. Now you stand on the summit, not triumphant, but still. From here, the world looks the same, yet nothing is the same. The cities still hum, the people still hurry, the seasons still turn, but you move through them differently. You no longer search for meaning, you carry meaning inside you. This is the stage Jung called the return, when the individuated soul steps back into the collective, no longer as its prisoner, but as its participant. The return from the inner journey. Every myth ends not with escape, but with return. Odysseus sails home. The Buddha descends the mountain. Christ leaves the desert. The hero who has seen the depths comes back, not to preach, but to live. In Jungian language, this is the completion of the individuation cycle. The self has met the world and found balance between inner and outer life. It is tempting, after awakening, to stay apart, to remain in silence, to guard peace from the noise of society. But the self does not evolve for isolation, it evolves for integration. Your light is not meant to stay hidden in meditation rooms and journals. It must walk the streets, stand in traffic, sit at the dinner table. Spiritual realization means nothing until it becomes ordinary. And so the work continues, learning how to live the truth you discovered, to bring stillness into movement, to remain whole amid fragmentation. The challenge of everyday consciousness. Coming down the mountain hurts more than climbing it. When you return to the city of daily life, you feel its density again, deadlines, noise, conversations that skim the surface. You may feel foreign, as if you speak a dialect no one understands. This dissonance is natural. The psyche must readjust to ordinary consciousness, carrying a treasure that few can see. Jung warned that inflation, the belief that enlightenment makes one superior, is the great danger after awakening. The ego, newly crowned with spiritual insight, can become arrogant, mistaking awareness for exemption. But the true self seeks humility. It whispers, you are not above life, you are within it. The measure of maturity is not how high you soar, but how gently you walk among those still asleep. To live your truth quietly, without needing to announce, correct, or convert, is the final art. The light in action. You begin to notice small opportunities to embody what you've learned. Listening fully when someone speaks, even if you disagree. Remaining patient when others rush. Forgiving without the need to be thanked. Each act is a spark, a way of threading the inner and outer worlds. When Jung wrote of active imagination, he meant precisely this, allowing inner wisdom to shape outer behavior. Your dreams become guides for decisions. Your intuition whispers practical instructions. Call this friend, change that job, plant this seed. At first these impulses seem subtle, but when followed, they lead to alignment. Synchronicities multiply. The right person calls, the right book appears, the right idea surfaces. It is not magic, it is a resonance. The universe rearranges itself around a soul that has stopped resisting its own truth. Wholeness in relationship. You used to seek relationships to fill emptiness. Now you enter them to share fullness. Love no longer feels like merging, but like meeting two complete selves standing face to face. You no longer demand that another heal your wounds, because you know healing is an interior labor. Instead, love becomes companionship on parallel journeys. You will still feel pain, even awakened hearts break. But now you suffer consciously. You allow grief to move through you without turning it into identity. The ego used to shout, I can't survive this. The self whispers, you already have. In Jung's view, this conscious relatedness marks the end of projection. You stop casting your shadow onto partners, parents, or enemies. You see everyone as mirror, not judge. And through this recognition, compassion replaces resentment. The mature balance, action and rest. The individuated soul learns to alternate between doing and being. There are days to build and days to breathe, days to speak and days to listen. You no longer measure worth by productivity or silence, but by harmony. The self moves like tide. It advances, it retreats, it never loses rhythm. When exhaustion returns, and it will, you don't call it failure. You understand the psyche contracts after expansion, the way lungs exhale after inhaling. Integration happens in these pauses. Rest becomes part of progress. The modern world glorifies motion. The awakened individual honors balance. You can work fiercely and rest fully, love deeply and let go gently. This equilibrium is not neutrality, but mastery, the capacity to hold opposites without tearing. Jung said, the greatest and most important problems in life are all, in a certain sense, insoluble. They can only be outgrown. Equilibrium is that outgrowing, a transcendence of conflict, not its elimination, serving without losing the self. Now the question arises, if everything I sought is within me, why engage the world at all? Because wholeness naturally expresses itself as service. A centered psyche radiates outward like a calm lake reflecting light. Others are drawn to its stillness. Service does not mean martyrdom, it means participation. You offer your gifts freely, not to prove worth, but because overflow demands expression. Maybe you write, maybe you teach, maybe you simply live kindly. In each case, your presence becomes a quiet blessing. Without preaching, you model what integration looks like. People around you sense it, the calm, the authenticity, the absence of pretense. Some will understand, others won't. It doesn't matter. The work is to keep living truth, not to advertise it. Jung wrote, a shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Your task is to live your pattern so completely that it encourages others to find theirs. That is the only form of leadership the soul recognizes. The shadows return. Even now, after all the light, the shadow does not vanish. It waits patiently, testing your humility. You still feel anger, jealousy, fear, but now you meet them differently. You welcome them as old friends returning with messages. When irritation rises, you ask, what part of me feels unseen? When envy stirs, you ask, what desire am I denying? When fear tightens your chest, you breathe and ask, what truth am I resisting? This ongoing dialogue keeps the psyche alive. Integration was never a one-time event. It is a relationship that must be maintained. Each shadow cycle brings deeper understanding, each confrontation greater peace. You realize there is no final enlightenment, only expanding circles of awareness. The soul's language, dreams become richer, synchronicities clearer, intuitions faster. It's as if the unconscious, once a stranger, now speaks fluently. You begin to live in two worlds at once, the visible and the invisible, without conflict. Logic and intuition, science and spirit, action and rest, all coexist. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge that unites contradictions into harmony. You start to perceive life itself as conversation, your choices as statements, the world's responses as replies. Coincidence becomes communication. A bird landing near you, a song lyric at the right moment, a sudden memory. These are no longer random. They are grammar in the language of the self. You listen with the whole body. You trust. The final freedom no one to become. At the start of the journey, you wanted to become better, wiser, healed, complete. Now you see that becoming was never about addition but subtraction, removing what was never you. The final freedom arrives when there is no one left to prove, no role left to play. You are not trying to be authentic. You simply are. In this simplicity lies immense power. You meet life as it comes without resistance, without performance. Pain and joy move through you, both belonging, both transient. You understand impermanence not as threat but as grace. Everything changes, and that is why everything is alive. Jung once told a student who asked how to live after analysis, live your life so that your light is not dependent on circumstances. This is that life, luminous without reason, peaceful without guarantee. The world as mirror. When you walk through crowds now, you no longer feel separate. Each face you pass contains an aspect of you. The tired mother, the ambitious student, the angry stranger, all reflections. You feel tenderness toward them because you recognize their battles. They are still climbing the mountain you already crossed. You do not interfere unless asked. You do not preach because you remember how noise once confused you. Instead, you embody quiet certainty. Your calm becomes invitation, not instruction. Transformation spreads not by argument but by resonance. Every smile, every act of patience, every honest word plants seeds. They may sprout years later, unseen by you, but that is the beauty of invisible work. It moves through the collective psyche like underground water, nourishing roots before blossoms appear. The self as source. Now you realize that the journey's 7 stages were never separate steps, but spiral movements of one process, the self-seeking expression through the ego. Loneliness called you inward. Self-soothing taught you tenderness. Refusing complaint gave you power. Self-validation grounded you. Failure purified you. Will shaped you. Silence awakened you. Together they formed a single revelation. Everything you sought outside was waiting inside all along. Strength was not gifted by the world. It grew from endurance. Love was not given by others. It bloomed from acceptance. Peace was not found in escape. It arose from presence. You are both the traveler and the mountain, the seeker and the light sought, living as the lighthouse. There's an old symbol. Jung loved the mandala, a circle with a radiant center. He saw it as the image of the self, balanced, whole, quietly luminous. When you live from the center, you become a living mandala. Your days spiral around meaning, not chaos. People sense the symmetry even if they can't name it. A lighthouse doesn't decide whom to save, it simply shines. The ships that recognize its light find direction, others sail on. Either way, the lighthouse loses nothing. That is how the awakened person serves the world, shining steadily, expecting nothing, withholding nothing. You speak less, listen more, and when you do speak, words carry gravity. Because they emerge from integration, they heal where empty talk once harmed. You realize you don't need to convince. Presence itself persuades. Eternal becoming. At last, you see that there is no final arrival. Individuation is a river, not a destination. You will drift, forget, remember, and drift again. Each new loss will test your depth. Each new joy will test your humility. But now you know how to return inward to the quiet flame that never extinguished. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But perhaps the deeper privilege is to keep becoming endlessly with awareness. For to live consciously is to keep dying and being reborn in the same breath. You dissolve daily, and daily you are remade.